My name is Brooke Diaz, and I'm with the Gettysburg Foundation. The foundation is the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service here at Gettysburg. And over the years, as we've presented Sacred Trust, we've had the great honor of hosting renowned Civil War authors, historians, National Park Service rangers, and licensed battlefield guides so that they can share their unique perspectives on the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg with you, our visitors. And this year is no exception. We have added an exciting element to this year's Sacred Trust. We are live streaming all of the talks, so if you have any friends and family who were not able to make it out, please let them know that they can watch all of these talks live on our website at gettysburgfoundation.org/Sacred Trust. For our first topic of the day, Brian Steele Wills presents The Fates of Gettysburg. Counterfactual history is always fascinating, and Wills will delve into such issues as, what if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg? Brian Steele Wills is the director of the Center of the Study of the Civil War Era and professor of history at Kennesaw State University. He's the author of numerous Civil War books, one of which, George Henry Thomas, As True as Steel, was the recipient of the 2013 Richard Barksdale Harwell Award for the best book on the Civil War topic, presented by the Civil War Roundtable of Atlanta. In 2000, Wills received the Outstanding Faculty Award from the Commonwealth of Virginia, one of 11 recipients from all faculty members at public and private institutions across the state. He was named Kenneth Ashbury Professor of History and won both the Teaching Award and the Research and Publication Award from the University of Virginia's College at Wise. Please join me in welcoming Brian Wills.
All right, well, I'm glad to be here all the way from Southwest Virginia because that's where I stopped on the way from Kennesaw. Otherwise, it'd have been about 12 or 13 hours, so I was trying to cut it down to about 7. And I understand sometimes why Robert E. Lee might not have wanted to come back a third time because that's a long way. So anyway, I hate to ever correct a wonderful Texan who's very vivacious and exciting, but she said I was going to tell you about Jackson. I'm not going to say a whole lot about Jackson. Mostly my talk is going to be focused on William Dorsey Pender, although I will talk about a few other things. But of course, the speculation about Jackson being here and what he might have done would depend on which Jackson showed up. Because if you study the Civil War, and I know many of you do because you're shaking your heads, you'll know that if you come from the valley as exciting and wonderful as you've been able to make these accomplishments with foot cavalry there, when you get to the 7 days, it's not such a great performance. And I think part of that's because these human beings were human. They got tired. They were worn down. And sometimes the expectations are greater than you can deliver, and sometimes you simply get exhausted. One of my favorite Confederate generals is a big old fellow from Kentucky named Abraham Buford. He's kin to another Buford who did a few things over here somewhere nearby. And Abe Buford was a real interesting fellow because he was a little over 300 pounds. Now, just a little while ago, I was probably in the Abe Buford category. I have worked on trying to whittle down a little bit. It's not because I'm gotten worn out and everything else. It's just because I couldn't walk the battlefields as effectively as William Howard Taft as I can maybe as Theodore Roosevelt. So I'm trying to work towards a Theodore Roosevelt size as opposed to the William Howard Taft. I'll never be James Madison. James Madison was about that thin and a little dyspeptic fellow, but I'm probably dyspeptic. I just don't have the thinness, but I never was. When I grew up, they liked to use the S word with me, stout. They loved to use that word. And back in the day, that was the word that was the common word. There are other words today that probably are less flattering, although I didn't care much for that one then. My name, again, is Brian Wills, and I am the director of the Civil War Center at Kennesaw State University, which is a growing university down in Georgia. It's north of Atlanta on the Interstate 75 going toward Chattanooga. It's now mostly on one side of the interstate, but now spread out to part of the other side of the interstate, and yet it's a beautiful campus, and I hope if you get a chance to come down, you'll come down and visit. If you expect to see a major museum that we run, you'll be disappointed. There is no museum at Kennesaw State University for the Civil War. There is, however, a nearby museum, the Southern Museum, that houses the generals. So you can come and we'll take you over to that. Or within about 15 or 20 minutes, depending on traffic, we can get you over to Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield, which just commemorated its 150th anniversary. All month long, in fact, Georgia was working with the fact that Sherman was on his way. And what we tried to do in Kennesaw was to just make sure that we confiscated the matches before the Yankees got there, so that there wouldn't be any renewal of urban renewal. But anyway, in all seriousness, we had a wonderful time and a wonderful outpouring of support in the community and also from people who traveled in to see that 150th commemoration. Some people will use the phrase celebration, and then they hesitate because of the numbers of people killed in the war. But I think you can do both. I think you can say you celebrate courage. You celebrate the willingness to sacrifice. You can celebrate certain aspects, but at the same time, you have to realize the terrible cost that was paid. I think you're going to get a taste of that cost today when you read about and hear about William Dorsey Pender and some of the other people that I'll bring to your attention today, the lesser lights. One of the recent reviews of the Pender book talked about that Dr. Wills likes to write about second-tier generals. Now, I will hesitate to say that George Henry Thomas was second-tier. I would say he's probably about the third, arguably the second best Union general in the war, certainly the third. But he mostly fights in the Western theater, so therefore he doesn't have the cachet as if he had been at Gettysburg or somewhere else in the Eastern theater where there was a lot more press. And the biggest problem with Henry Thomas was that he didn't push himself. He didn't sell himself very hard. He figured that his actions would speak for themselves. Now, that's not true of William Dorsey Pender. William Dorsey Pender is never afraid to go ahead and promote what he's doing or capable of doing, and his greatest promotion was actually in the letters to his wife that he wrote, and we have a tremendous trove of materials because of that communication, because of that correspondence. And with William Dorsey Pender, you get a highly educated young man who's learning to be a lot of things at one time. He's learning to be a husband, a father, an officer, and of course later on a general. And so he's got a lot of different roles to play. And actually one of the more interesting roles is right at the very beginning of the disturbance. We'll call it that as opposed to something else, because if you like the war between the states, you won't like it being called the Civil War if you like it the other way. And so we'll call it the disturbance. My favorite is actually a phrase from the movies. I wrote a book about the Civil War in the movies that I love, and it's the term the late unpleasantness. The late unpleasantness. We can rephrase it that way if you'd like. But you'll notice when you see Pender, someone who's contradictory, who's got a lot of the elements of ambition and yet a certain amount of understanding that that can go too far. In fact, his wife will remind him of that on occasion. We do have one of her letters that survived because he wrote a little note and sent it back. It's a shame we don't have the rest, because I imagine that that was a very interesting relationship that got expressed on paper very, very well. But we don't have her letters, simply, I'm sure, because he kept them himself in the field, and I'm sure they didn't survive. Now, I have on the screen that I think you'll be able to see. I'm not sure exactly what you're seeing. I see what I'm seeing, but I assume you're seeing a picture of Pender, and then on the cover of my book, and then a couple other things that I've written that are related. The letters of Pender, I wrote an introduction for that. That's the little volume, and the blue volume is The War Hits Home, which was mostly about southeastern Virginia in the Civil War, and we'll talk about a couple of aspects of that. But you'll notice the quote that we would have succeeded at Gettysburg had it not been for Pender's death, had Pender lived. And no less a figure than Robert E. Lee is supposed to have said that. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and that's where the counterfactual part comes. We'll never know what the South would have accomplished if Jackson had been here or if Pender had lived. We'll never know what would have happened if Robert E. Lee had decided to strike on day one and then pull back and wait to see what would happen. The general that we know liked to pull back is a general who ultimately got fired from his job. His name was Joseph Johnston. And there was the old argument that in the Atlanta campaign, Joe Johnston, if you'd have let him, would have retreated all the way to Macon, Georgia. Well, some people say all the way to the Keys in Florida, and some people even make the argument to Cuba if he could have gotten the boating. You know, sure, certainly pulling back is something you could do, but it presents its own set of problems. So it's not just one of those things that you can engage an enemy force that is not entirely clear to you exactly the size of it and the disposition of it, and that you can then pull back and somehow the enemy will do what you want. And that was part of Joe Johnston's problem in Atlanta, is that Sherman just constantly did to Joe Johnston what Joe Johnston would have preferred he not do, and didn't do what Johnston preferred, which was he hoped string out and leave himself open, kind of like a boxing match that he could land a knockout blow. Is Gettysburg the knockout blow? Is that what Robert E. Lee hopes to accomplish? And of course, most of you know that situation as well or better than I do. Gettysburg's a place that I've visited since I was a wee lot, as they say, a wee lad. And I was here with my family and sister many years ago, and been here many times since. But you know, Gettysburg is one of those things that places that leads itself to all of these speculations and ideas. All right, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Dorsey, Fanny, and the service that he had before he came to the great disturbance that occurred in the 1860s. He was in the regular Army or Old Army. He was West Point. He was a middle range student. He really wasn't a great student, and he doesn't have high ranking, but he wasn't dead last in his class either. He does become very, very close friends with a person whose family member, whose younger sister is Fanny Shepherd, and after they graduate from West Point, they actually visit for a period of time in North Carolina. He is originally from Tarboro area, North Carolina, and born in 1834, February 6, 1834, and Fanny is born about 6 years later. And she and her family were in Salem. If you go to Winston-Salem, you're in the area of Salem, North Carolina today. And when they went back home to visit, before they went off to their duty stations, Pender met and fell in love with Fanny, and that results ultimately in a marriage in 1859. So right before the great disturbance occurs, William Dorsey Pender is going to be married, and you can see a couple of images of him and an image of Fanny. His early service is very fascinating and not really reflected in the slide here. His early service was to go into Baltimore and try to recruit from anyone who might be of Southern sympathies there and ship them south for potential service under the brand spanking new Confederate States of America. Again, you know the history lessons. When Abraham Lincoln is elected, South Carolina takes umbrage and decides to secede from the United States. And the other Deep South states soon follow. Well, Pender is not going to wait for North Carolina to make up its mind. Pender is going to leave, he's going to resign his commission and leave the old Army and then be put to service immediately. And I know he partly hoped that would be because opportunities for promotion would be immediate. I mean, if you come out with old Army service with West Point credentials, that he would be able to be one of these individuals who would be able to be assigned to some high level. It's not going to quite work out that way for him. The path to promotion didn't open up automatically. And ultimately, he ends up being charged with recruiting in North Carolina. But that initial service is actually up in Baltimore, where he sends back a fairly limited number of recruits to the Deep South. Interestingly enough, he's on a steamer on his way back when word comes of Fort Sumter. So he's on his way back to the Deep South from Baltimore, where he finds out that there is now a conflict that he's coming back to. Of course, the first capital of Confederacy was Montgomery, Alabama, so much of the action is out of Montgomery. But if you didn't have opportunities there, the states could provide opportunities, and Pender was not afraid to cultivate those as well. So he'll end up being in the area of Raleigh and trying to train troops, and then ultimately assigned to camps around Weldon. So I've tried to highlight those. For me, one of the more interesting points is when it comes to Suffolk, Virginia. My hometown is Suffolk. I grew up in Old Nansemond County, which is the county that now no longer exists. It is Suffolk. Suffolk's the third area-wide largest city in the world, and it's located in southeastern Virginia. By the way, I mentioned Kennesaw where I teach. Kennesaw has now got 25,000 students. People don't realize how big Kennesaw is. In a slight year's time, there will be a consolidation with another school that will bring it to 31,000. So it'll go from the third largest school in Georgia to the second largest school in Georgia behind the University of Georgia, which I also have a connection to. Now you'll notice I've got at least a piece of the flag of 6 North Carolina. That's what Pender's associated with early. And I like it that it talks about deeds, not words. Now Pender is a man of words, but he likes to think of himself as a man of deeds, and he will spend a lot of time trying to mold these folks into soldiers. Now, Pender's a fascinating guy. Remember, he's got a man of contradictions. The old Army, apparently Andrew Jackson Smith was his captain, was his commander, and I don't know that he made untoward advances to Fanny, but apparently they were untoward enough that Pender got worked up about it. And he will tell his wife, you know, I don't mind you doing whatever you do, but I really don't want you dancing with him. Don't let him be the one that takes you around and takes you out and does the fancy dances. I'd really rather you not do that. Save them for me. He was actually out on active operations. They weren't all that active at that moment, but he was on active operations in Washington, in old Washington state territory at the time. And when he got back, he was, I'm sure, glad to have Fanny to himself. He was very proprietary in that sense. But interestingly enough, when he gets to Suffolk, Virginia, now that he's slowly sort of working his way toward the front in the Eastern Theater, he's still not there yet. Suffolk's the backwater still, but when he gets there, one of the first things he does as now a colonel is to celebrate his own position. He accepts every invitation to anything, and he does it with great joy and gusto. And so he brags about it and tells about it to his wife. And you can imagine that she's back home by now. Children are involved in the story. And the last thing you want to hear is what a wonderful good time he's having with everybody that walks on 2 legs, especially if they're female. So Pender is having a big old time, and he uses a lot of very, very straightforward language to say that I've dined tonight with beautiful women, and there are a lot of beautiful women around, and telling that to his wife. So, you know, whatever you want to say, if you ever heard the story about the couple that are riding along, and the wife says, if you'd like to go to the restroom, that will be fine with me, and the husband drives right past the exit. And the wife looks at him and says, why did you do that? That was the exit. I needed to go to the restroom. And he said, well, you didn't say that. Well, she did say that. She just didn't say that in language he understood. And believe me, by the time they made it to the next exit, he understood the language very, very well. You know, there's some feeling, by the way, about George Thomas that he might have been influenced by his wife. His wife said, Virginia born, by the way, he was, and Southampton County, which is the neighboring county to Nansemond County, and where Suffolk is. And he ends up going with the North. And so the argument is that his northern-born Troy, New York wife influenced him. She says that they never once discussed these matters. And those of you among the audience and those of you listening by live stream understand that if you're married, you don't always have to have the words spoken to you so you understand what is expected of you. But they claim that had no influence on his choice whatsoever. Well, Pender is in Suffolk. He's having a good time, and yes, ultimately he uses the F word at a letter to his wife. He said, oh, he can't use that. Flirting. He uses the word flirting. I have been flirting. And so someone points out that he might have been engaged in more serious activities. I don't think so. I think he just was he was so caught up with himself. He was really conceited. I'll just use that word. He was conceited. And he had this feeling that he was special, and he loved listening to people tell him how special he was, and especially if they were beautiful women. So he's writing all this. Well, she writes back a letter, and she says, read to end. Well, the minute he saw read to end, he probably should have put the letter away. for his own self-feeling, for his self-worth. But unfortunately for him, or fortunately, maybe because of our story, he is going to read that letter. And she asks him, "What in your sober senses made you think I wanted to hear all that?" And she lays him out. And so in a contrite little message, he sends back a note to her. And he says, "Today this war holds no terrors for me. You know, I've been laid low by my own wife. What else can I experience? What else can I do?" And then a short time later, he says my favorite line of all times, which I put in as a chapter in the Pender book, "My dancing days are over." And honestly, he meant it. He really did stop doing that sort of thing and change the chapter. And I think we all know the words. He grew up. He grew up, and he learned, he matured, he grew up, and he understood now better what his responsibilities should be. And I put Rhett Butler just because I love Gone with the Wind. I love the movies, so Gone with the Wind was Dorsey, Pender, Rhett Butler. No, he was not Rhett Butler. All right, so Pender is not going to really be on the active campaign scene until the Peninsula Campaign. And then once George McClellan is marching his way up, Pender is going to join the forces of Joseph E. Johnston, and he's going to be the one who then is in line to be in the rest of the major campaigns of what becomes the Army of Northern Virginia and ultimately under Robert E. Lee from then on until Gettysburg. So I've just put a map that shows you the Peninsula Campaign and the movement of the troops up. It wasn't very exciting until you got to Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, and that's where it got very exciting for Pender. And William Dorsey Pender is engaged in this fighting for the first major time. He has to order troops into battle. He was the kind of person who really did have a lot of questions, a lot of self-doubts. Part of that's good because that motivates you to be better than you would be if you didn't. If you had this sort of notion that you knew all and could do all, you would probably be in trouble from that. But he didn't have to worry about that. He was the kind of individual that understood that he did not have all knowledge, and he was learning sort of on the job. And so he makes, some authors will say, he makes mistakes on the battlefield and orders the men to attack when it would have been better to withhold the attacks and doesn't press the attacks when they should be pressed. Well, I'm not one of these people, and I love Ed Bars and all the others that can tell you where the 5th Michigan stood for 3 minutes before it moved over here. And I'm just not one of those folks. I've never really gotten into history that way. I look at the broader picture. So if you want to know the exact locations of all these troops, you might have to get Ed to come and help you. But one of the things that's interesting is that Pender comes under the eyes of important people, and he is going to be viewed in his actions by no less than the President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. And as the story goes, Davis comes up, and in his exuberance for what Pender is doing at that moment, says, "General Pender, I salute you." And so he gets sort of a battlefield promotion. Well, he really doesn't, but that's just the way that the story goes, and that's the way that supposedly Davis reacted, perhaps in excitement about that situation at that moment. So Seven Pines or Fair Oaks is going to be where Pender is going to begin to be associated with the Army of Northern Virginia, and of course, after Joe Johnston's wounding and replacement initially for a very short term by another individual, ultimately fairly quickly by Robert E. Lee. He will be under Robert E. Lee from then on out. The 7 days, Pender does not see a lot of action. He's very heavily involved. In a minute, you'll see some images from Mechanicsville. He's very involved in that engagement, or Beaver Dam Creek as it's called. And he is engaged a little bit on the 27th at Gaines Mill, but from then on, he's really not, and he's spared the worst bloodletting, which of course is Malvern Hill, that occurs at the end of this set of days that Robert E. Lee is trying to drive George McClellan from the gates of Richmond. So you got a picture there of Robert E. Lee, a picture of George McClellan. I always love pictures of McClellan because he's so self-assured, isn't he? All right, at Mechanicsville or Beaver Dam Creek, Pender is going to be involved on the Confederate right. He is going to find very quickly that, again, realities and the textbook don't always match. And one of the things I do think is fascinating is that he will spend time boning up, if you will, rereading his textbooks as manuals and trying to make sure that, again, he's as sharp as he can be. And at Beaver Dam Creek or Mechanicsville, he's going to encounter substantial Union resistance, a heavily defended position that's on the backside of a swamp. And so a lot of the action is going to be with men flailing through a swamp or trying to cross very narrow bridges that provide avenues of fire for the Federal artillery on the distance. And you can see some images that suggest the terrain or the territory, one of the period or roughly the period, and then one more modern that shows that. I also put Roswell Ripley there because Ripley and Pender are the ones who are going to press and try to force their way across that swampy area at Beaver Dam Creek. At 2nd Manassas, which is his next major action, William Dorsey Pender will be again in support, although he ultimately comes up because Jackson needs everybody, and this is where he is going to see action under Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. And at one point, he's going to be struck. I think, unfortunately for Pender, he had a habit, a tendency to be hit one way or the other, and sometimes that was just discomforting or uncomfortable, and sometimes it was worse than that. We'll see a little bit later. But here he's trying to soften the blow, if you will, to his wife. He's telling her what his circumstances are and the degree to which the injury that he suffered is, and he tries to make it sound like it's really not that big a deal. It apparently was a pretty substantial cut on the top of his head. And of course, if you've ever had a cut on your face or your head, you know that it can bleed profusely and not necessarily be so bad. But as we're all learning, and I think everybody's learning this more and more, head injuries are nothing to be sneered at. Head injuries are significant things. And any blow to the head, I remember years ago I played a little bit of football. I was short but mean. And I played fullback and linebacker. So when I came in to hit people, I tried to hit them so that, number one, they would know I'd do it. Number two, they'd remember it the next time. And sometimes I'd hit a cornerback, and the cornerback would have his eyes on me instead of his job, which is what I wanted him to do. So I learned early on, because I hit them helmet to helmet sometimes, and you get those little rings and the bells and the flowers and the butterflies, and I probably have severe brain damage now, which explains why I'm a professor. So, you know. Somebody said if you thought you were going to have only an hour left to live, you'd want it to be in a faculty meeting, because it would seem to go on forever. You know, I'm not trying to put my fellow faculty members down. They've just turned down the live stream and said, there goes Wills again. You can't control him. All right, so anyway, Pender's actually going to be engaged again in this sort of rear line. It then moves forward and fights as Stonewall Jackson is trying to hold his ground against John Pope and try to hold on until help can come in the form of James Longstreet. And ultimately, Longstreet does arrive and rolls up the Federal lines, and Pender's one of those people that describes what he saw and how he comes as he comes to a field and sees the action, the panorama in front of him. And he really did appreciate the sort of drama and panorama of war. I think he really thought it was certainly something that was, you know, staggering to see unfold in front of you. One of the comments, you know, General Lee will make is it's well that war is so terrible. You know, we would grow too fond of it, and I think we have to remember that. Harper's Ferry is where ultimately Pender is involved in the operation that's moving into Maryland after the success at 2nd Manassas. Robert E. Lee decides to move north, and Pender is going to be part of Jackson's effort to reduce the garrison at Harper's Ferry, and it does pretty darn well. Pender is actually the commander who sends his troops to a key hill position on the Confederate right and puts the Confederates in a position to help convince the Federals that it's time to call it a day. The Federals, of course, were also convinced because the higher ground was laced with artillery, and that artillery could fire on Harper's Ferry almost at will. And so if you just look at the enormous haul of food, forage, materials of war, etc., that are going to be brought into General Robert E. Lee's forces. Of course, Lee is busy elsewhere and will be occupied at a place called Antietam, or Sharpsburg. And ultimately, Jackson has to move as fast as he can to bring his troops over to support Robert E. Lee. So in the battle, that's the bloodiest single day of the war, Robert E. Lee is going to be grateful, I'm sure, because first of all, McClellan doesn't attack him everywhere at once, and he's able to sort of take the piecemeal action of the battle, and at the end of the day, have A.P. Hill, Ambrose Powell Hill, with whom Pender is serving, move up, as I put it, in the nick of time, showing up just in time to help keep the whole thing from unraveling in a way that, frankly, by now it finally is beginning to do. Of course, Burnside's bridge is down in the general vicinity of the area that Hill starts to send his troops and arrive, as I mentioned, sort of in the nick of time. Now, one of the engagements that people know a little less about, that Pender was actually heavily involved in, was the fighting that takes place in the aftermath. I'm going forward. I found that these things end up having a life of their own, and they'll start going forward on you whether you like it or not. So if it does, just ignore me. I'm just here. But you'll notice that this is September 19th, so it's just shortly after the Battle of Antietam. And look at the description. I always think it's interesting. Soldiers describing things are fascinating to me. And A.P. Hill talks about there commenced the most terrible slaughter that this war has yet witnessed. They just went through Antietam. They just went through Antietam. But remember, Hill is late getting there. Had he been there, I don't know that he could have made that comment. But then I think it's also interesting, the broad surface of the Potomac was blue with the floating bodies of our foe, but few escaped to tell the tale. Now, I wrote a book about Nathan Bedford Forrest, and he was involved in one of the most controversial incidents of the war in Fort Pillow, at Fort Pillow, north of Memphis, in April 1864. He uses virtually the same language to describe the aftermath of Fort Pillow, and everybody says, "Massacre! Massacre!" Well, you don't hear people saying that about Hill. He's just describing what he's seeing, and he's describing it in dramatic fashion. The bodies are floating. The Potomac is blue. There's a slaughter. I mean, he's using language that Forrest, similar language that Forrest uses. And by the way, Forrest had only 6 months of formal education, so he tended to let his staff people do his writing. But he would say if it doesn't have the right note, give it a new tune. In other words, if he'd have them read it to him and it didn't say what he wanted, he'd make them rewrite it. So those were, in essence, his words. And he understood words. He understood words. One of the things I love, I'm digressing, but that's okay. I still got a couple minutes. Warren will warn me when I don't. But to me, Forrest is fascinating because here's a guy who understood things instinctively. I mean, very brilliant on a battlefield. His capability of assessing situations and his opponent's mindset and manipulating things. Using bluff as well as bluster. He has 29 horses shot out from under him and kills 30 enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. Most of that is a general, okay? And he wades into them. Well, when he is carried away, you know, he will sometimes use language that if he has time to think about it, or allow language to be used that if he had time to think about it, he might have changed it or watered it down or whatever. But he's caught up in the moment, and if somebody uses terms like slaughter or, again, the river was dyed with blood, that's part of the deal. Forrest, as I said, only had 6 months of formal education. He said, "I never saw a pen that I didn't think of a snake." He must have thought about snakes like I do. In southeastern Virginia, where I grew up, if you walked along, it was a very distinct possibility you'd step on a creature called a water moccasin. Some people call them cottonmouths, a water moccasin. So people ask me, why do you look down? Because I don't want to step on a snake. And I think we understand how Forrest felt about it. Pender could describe things in these kinds of ways as well, again, because he was so well educated, and he's frequently describing these things to his wife. So he's kind of mitigating it when he thinks it might scare her or frighten her, but he's celebrating it, and I mean celebrating it, because when he did something, he was usually proud of it, I'll just tell you. And if he wasn't, and he could sometimes be very, very critical, self-critical. I always say that people, when I use self-deprecating humor, do not rush to my defense, and they usually don't. But for Pender, he was always sort of 1 minute glowing and proud and pushing, and the next minute humbling and so forth. By the way, his wife, very deeply religious. And so was Forrest's wife, by the way, so kind of interesting. But Pender's wife was very deeply religious, and Pender becomes religious and is baptized in front of his regiment as a colonel. So it's pretty amazing the journey that he takes. But at this battle where the casualties are relatively low, Hill is using these kinds of excessive terms to describe it, and Pender is in the thick of the fighting. This is an engagement his men very much were involved in. All right, the next big battle that Pender is a part of is the Battle of Fredericksburg, and you'll notice that they're off on, again, the Confederate flank. I think it's kind of interesting, and this might flash forward. If it does, I'll try to catch it and turn it back. But I think it's very interesting that everybody says Fredericksburg is this great disaster, and Burnside's the worst general in world history. I think the History Channel has said that. Okay, fine. If you were Governor Wise in eastern North Carolina, you'd beg to differ, because Roanoke Island was pretty much a Confederate disaster, and guess who did it? Burnside. If you're James Longstreet, and we all love Longstreet, if you're a Longstreet fan, guess who kicked Longstreet's rear end at Knoxville, Tennessee? Burnside. So I guess you say whatever you want to say. But had this attack been successful, the Confederate flank would have been compromised at Fredericksburg, and the assaults that are most famous, that are put on in the movies, that are put on television, and so forth, might not have been the kinds of glamorous disaster, for lack of better terms, that they are shown to be. And George Gordon Meade might have been a hero before he gets to another place in Pennsylvania. So at the railroad tracks, as Meade is trying to push across and threaten the Confederate flank, Pender is part of the forces that try to hold that line and find themselves in great duress. Frankly, there's a period of time where the Federals have found a crack in the Confederate line and are starting to push through. And Pender is part of the group of soldiers that are forced to come in and try to hold the line, if you will, and do a magnificent job if you're a Confederate, a unfortunate job if you're a Federal, because, of course, it prevents this flank from being collapsed. And, of course, one of the heroes is John Pelham, the gallant Pelham, on the far flank. But Pender is certainly very much in the mix, fighting against the forces of George Gordon Meade. Now, after Fredericksburg, of course, we know the Mud March was a thorough disaster for the Federals, and then Burnside's replaced by Joseph Hooker. Fighting Joe Hooker is going to engage in operations that are going to be pretty impressive at the beginning, because he's going to kind of steal a march on Lee, and Lee has got a force that's very whittled down. The winter was very hard on the Confederate forces. They had to spread their command across a wide range to keep it fed and provisioned. And one of the things that happens in southeastern Virginia, in the area that I wrote about, is a campaign that takes James Longstreet, a guy named Pickett, you've probably heard of him, and another fellow by the name of John Bell Hood, away from Robert E. Lee's forces. It forces him to be creative, and fortunately he still has Stonewall Jackson, at least initially, and attacks on the flank. Well, Pender is part of that flank attack that helps to crush Howard's forces and push them back towards the critical crossroads. But in the aftermath, we know that Jackson rides out to reconnoiter, then comes back in the wrong part of the line, is not recognized by the forces that he's approaching as friendly, and they fire into his command or into his small force, and Jackson and a number of others are struck. And, of course, Pender is one of the first people that comes to Jackson's side and tries to say that I think we might need to reposition to just make sure that we don't undo the things we've accomplished, the things we've done so far on day one here at Chancellorsville. And famously, Jackson says, "You will hold your ground, sir. You will hold your ground, General Pender." So he is the one who gives that order to Pender. And Pender was never not going to hold his ground. In fact, if he repositions, he's doing it for the purpose of holding his ground. And then Pender runs a little bit of afoul of his chief later on in the fighting after the campaign is continued, the fighting is continued. And as the Federals withdraw from Chancellorsville. It's Pender who is the one who's in the wrong place at the wrong time, not pushing fast enough for Robert E. Lee, and therefore taking some of his ire, some of his wrath upon himself. Why, General Pender, that is what you young men are always doing. You allow these people to get away. I tell you what to do, but you don't do it. Go after them and damage them all you can. I can tell you he did not write that to his wife and tell her that I just got blessed out by General Lee. And I know he took it personally because he took all these things personally, but I don't think that Lee was directing that specifically to him, even though he uses him as the example. I think that's the point. He's using him to try to make a larger point that he felt like the victory that they were winning could be more decisive. All right, at day one at Gettysburg, that's when Pender has now reached the apex of his career thus far. A.P. Hill moves up after the death of Jackson, and Pender moves up as well. So Pender is now finally reaching the level at which he can command larger numbers of troops and command a greater authority. And his troops are the ones that are going to again come up at the end of day one and press against the collapsing Federals. As we know, John Buford held his ground for a while John Reynolds came up. We know that Reynolds is killed, and as the Confederates finally began to push their way through, a lot of individual problems and disasters. Archer certainly would tell you that at the railroad cut, that not all things went well. But generally speaking, they were okay for the Confederates, and going to get a little better at the end of the day as Pender comes up. When Pender strikes, he is going to help finally push the Federals back through Gettysburg and onto the ground beyond. He is not at the front leading the men from the front, and so he is one of those folks that, again, is going to react to things as they unfold. And one of the things that he'll notice is that there are large numbers of Union troops approaching. He thinks that the attack, which has had troubles throughout, with previous forces being broken up and retreating and pulling back, and he's seen it and witnessed it, he now is afraid that the Federals are breaking through, and it turns out, as he's pointed out to him, that those are not attacking troops, they're prisoners. So on day one, things have gone reasonably well. On day two, Pender is supposed to be part of an attack that coordinates with Longstreet, that's going to roll up the Federal flank and center and try to do the very best they can to end the battle as quickly as possible. And of course, Lee's conception of how that will play out and the actual reality of how it will play out are two different things. And unfortunately, Pender is not going to have the opportunity to engage in fighting here, because he's going to be severely wounded when a shell hits and fragments, and part of the fragments go into his leg. So on day three, Pender's not there. Day three is not going to be a day when Pender, with the rest of North Carolina, can point the way, as they like to say. And of course, I say Virginia points the way too, because in my next slide, when you look at the casualties that are listed, the total casualties for Gettysburg, that small list is just one set of people from southeastern Virginia that were at the wall at Gettysburg, at the high water mark, if you will. And you can see a number of them are mortally wounded or killed in action. Well, at the end of the day, what do we have to show for it? Pender is going to be taken back wounded, ultimately to Staunton, Virginia, where the wound is going to reopen. It had actually been a problem that developed along the way, and he, with his own mentality, took a hairbrush and created a tourniquet and kept himself from bleeding to death on the way home. Well, back in Staunton, Virginia, all of the repairs come undone again, and they surgeons decide to take the leg. And within a few hours, William Dorsey Pender, who is now just 29 years old, leaving behind a wife, 2 children that he knows about, and one that's on the way that he will never see, is going to die. He does talk about that he feels like that he will see Fanny and the children again, that he's assured of his salvation and assured of his final destination. For the Confederates, there's a sense that they have lost a key figure that could have been helpful in the war going forward. A.P. Hill will talk about Pender in very glowing terms, that no one fell whose promise was greater than Pender. And of course, Robert E. Lee will say more than once that he recognizes Pender among the individuals that he considered to be primary figures in the success of his Army of Northern Virginia. At this point in September 1863, he's actually reacting to what he thinks has finished Hood off at Chickamauga. So if Hood has indeed died at Chickamauga, which he does not do, severely wounded again, actually wounded at Gettysburg, wounded at Chickamauga, he's got a bad arm, missing a leg by the time he's finished. Things are bad for Hood, but he does survive. But at least Lee's initial reaction is, I've lost some of my best men, Stonewall Jackson, William Dorsey Pender, and John Bell Hood. William Dorsey Pender will have his comments on his grave in Tarboro, North Carolina, that you can still visit today. He says, my only regret at the end of as he was dying, the only regret is to leave my wife and two children, and a third child was on the way that he will never know. Patriot by nature, soldier by training, Christian by faith, I think really reflects the values of his life. Fanny will live on. She does not. I know Bud Robertson likes to talk about the widow that turns her head to the wall and just dies. She doesn't. She keeps on raising kids and holding down jobs, including a postmistress position and teaching, and lives until 1922. Of course, Gettysburg is one of those things that I'm always fascinated by because I love the movies and I love to be here. So again, I can't tell you how much I enjoy being here. And of course, one of my favorite things is to do a talk on the Civil War in the movies and sort of compare the figures in the films with the real live figures that you see. And of course, to me, one of the people that was missing, unfortunately, from the film is that fellow right there, Warren. If Warren isn't where he needs to be, things could be much different. And so with that, I'll finish and also give you a chance to ask a few questions. I guess we have 5 minutes left? Okay, very good. And so thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have a question back here, and I'll try to repeat the question not only for you in the audience, but the live stream. Okay, well, we've got a mic. That'll help.
Actually, my question is a Thomas question.
Okay, all right.
In the spectrum of the relationship of Thomas, Grant, and Sherman, can you give me a couple examples of ways that Thomas irritated Grant prior to Nashville?
Yes.
And also elaborate on how important was Sherman's failure at Missionary Ridge and Thomas's success influential in this relationship between Grant and Thomas.
Okay, just very quickly, in case that message did not get through, it was a question about Grant, Sherman, and Thomas and their relationships, and then also about comparing sort of what Thomas did and what Sherman did at Missionary Ridge. First of all, very quickly, so that we can get at least another couple of questions, Thomas and Grant, I do not honestly believe, hated each other. People will say they hated each other. I just don't see that. They were very different in the way they viewed war and very different in the way they waged war. And Thomas irritated both Sherman and Grant. Bless his heart, Sherman, of course, claimed to be Thomas's best friend. If you have a best friend like that, you might want to be careful because Thomas, in my title of my book, I said, as true as steel. That's a quote from Sherman. And what he says, though, he may be slow, but he is as true as steel. So it's a sort of a backhand, and then he sort of pats him on the back. So either you get a backhand first or a backhand second with Sherman. Sherman was upset because, of course, he thought Thomas was making him look bad. Well, Grant's bogged down at Petersburg, or ultimately bogged down at Petersburg, and so Sherman really hopes to kind of press and push and so forth. Now, if he can break through in ways that Grant can't, guess who can kind of emerge as the hero of the war? And he felt like the Army of the Cumberland was slowing him down. He said they can see a furrow in the field and they stop to dig in. At Missionary Ridge, Sherman was brought in by Grant. Grant, of course, replaced Thomas. Thomas replaced Rosecrans. After Chickamauga, Thomas is the Rock of Chickamauga. He takes over in Chattanooga until Grant gets there. There is a moment of awkwardness when Grant first arrives that, again, some people say is cold between the two of them. I just think it's awkward because Thomas liked preparation, and when the boss shows up and he didn't expect him, it threw him off. I think it threw him off. He didn't hate him. He wasn't trying to be rude or disrespectful. Now, I don't think the staffs liked each other, but that's a different issue. Okay, bottom line, Sherman will ultimately come in, and that's who Grant hopes will take the job at Missionary Ridge and accomplish it. And what he runs into is Pat Claiborne at Tunnel Hill in Chattanooga and gets turned back, and it's ultimately Grant's main success comes at Missionary Ridge with George Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland. Other questions? One more question back here in the back. You want to?
The A.J. Smith who flirted with Dorsey Pender's wife is the same A.J. Smith who whips Bedford Forrest at Tupelo, right?
Okay. Now, I think that's an interesting question. A.J. Smith's the same A.J. Smith that whips Forrest that had upset Pender, and the answer is yes. A.J. Smith, though, would say, Nathan Bedford Forrest, however, would say that Smith did not beat him at Tupelo, he beat Stephen Lee. And that points out another one of those interesting Forrest elements. Forrest was always explaining things away to his own benefit. He was favored to do that. And he will tell James Harrison Wilson after Selma, Alabama, at the end of the war, "You're the only one that ever beat me." Well, he had lost at Tupelo. He'd actually lost at Parker's Crossroads. You can probably point to places where you could say he lost. But to Forrest, he lived to fight another day, and that was good enough. Any more questions? Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Pender and some of the other characters, and certainly, again, thank you for coming out on this beautiful day.